Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Wine, Women, and Words. And joining me, as always, is Michelle.
Hello.
And our special guest this evening is Christine Sneed. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here with both of you and your dachshunds.
Yes, Lilo has decided she's going to make an appearance. So at some point during the show, she may or may not stick her head up and judge you, but don't get offended by it. She judges
She,
everybody equally. It's a long-standing thing. My dog is a snob. I apologize.
we have to create the hashtag Lilo judges you and just take pictures, like screenshots of any time Lilo is judging any of us.
Hmm. It's a thing. I feel like we should put it on like t-shirts and hats.
Does she have
Right? Like,
Instagram? She needs her own merch.
what was that?
Does she have her own Instagram?
No, she doesn't. I feel like my husband would be very upset with me if I did that because she's already the queen of the house. And she would just take her divaness to a whole nother level if she did have her own Instagram. I mean, you could see the judgy face. Yes, I
That's
am
not full
making fun.
judgy though yet. She's warming up.
She
She's
is.
judging you right now though.
Oh
Like,
yeah. Oh,
Mom,
she is because I moved her. But
I don't
anyways, we're not here
perform
to
on
talk about
cue.
but we are not here to talk about my dog as much as I can like fully have a full 2 hour class dedicated to dogs in general. We're here to talk with Christine about her books. And from what I understand, now your most recent book was in June, Direct Sunlight, but as you were saying, you had three come out right in a row this past year. There was Please Be Advised, and then there's also you also wrote in an anthology, correct?
Yes, Love in the Time of Time's Up. It's a story collection or a short fiction anthology that I edited. So it's got 17 stories by 16 different women identifying writers.
Very interesting. And with short stories are such a different beast from novels when it comes to crafting them and everything. And how do you get the inspiration to do these short stories?
I often start with a title. It's kind of, I think it's sort of like a lot of writers I've heard talk about how they find titles really difficult. And I do too at times if I don't have it at the beginning. For the novels that I've published, other than the most recent one, Please Be Advised, I had hard time finding a title that I liked for those two books, Little Known Facts and Paris, he said. I'm still not that big of a fan of either title, but for stories, I don't know if it's because I was a poetry MFA. That was my specialization when I was a graduate student in creative writing. I often worked where I had a same thing when I was working on a poem. I usually had a title, and then I would go from there and figure out sort of the dramatic situation for the poem from that, and also sort of the tone. And the same thing is true with short stories. I usually have a title, and I keep a notebook. I'm guessing both, you both keep a notebook with ideas. And Several
I
everywhere.
was gonna say
Yeah.
several. I
Yeah, and
have a
not just
whole
your
box of
phone.
used
Like
notebooks.
I feel like you have to have the tactile experience of writing the words on the page.
Mhm.
So sometimes if I want to work on something new, I'll look at this notebook, which is really beat up, and I've had it for more than 20 years. One of the couple that I have, and I'll find titles in there. Sorry for the racket. I'll find titles in there that I'm like, oh, maybe I could write a story based on this title. So they always feel like a new beginning too, where when you're working on a novel, I know Diana, you have two that you've published in the last
Mhm.
3 years, and they're just there. It's such a you cannot really see the end at the beginning, but with a short story, you even if you don't know how it's going to end, you can at least see the ending. So it feels less
Mhm.
daunting
Mhm.
than undertaking like a 90 or 100,000 word manuscript, a long form fiction
Right.
manuscript.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. And for me, I don't know, sometimes I feel like the short story is more daunting because am I correct in thinking that all of the things that you need in a novel have to be compressed within the how many words is a short story considered? What, like less than 10,000, somewhere around there?
Usually, yeah,
Yeah.
usually somewhere
Yeah,
between
so
3 and 8 are the main, that's the main
okay.
range.
So yeah, you kind of have to compress all of those elements into such a short time that I don't know, that
Yeah.
intimidates me.
It's funny, you're not the first person who said that. And I teach, usually I prefer my students, my grad students even, to write short stories in the workshops that they take with me, but most of them are working on novels.
Hmm.
In part because that's probably mostly what they read, but also, as you both doubtless know, novels are what agents are looking for usually, and publishers want to publish novels and they can market those more effectively. At least that's what they say. So there are obviously exceptions, like George Saunders and Alice Munro, the Canadian short story writer who won the Nobel Prize. I think it was 2012. I mean, she can publish story. Well, she's retired now, but I mean, she was known for writing short fiction, and they were always happy to publish a new book by her. But most writers, if they are publishing story collections with big presses, they're usually also writing novels. So, and publishing those. But the story collection is kind of like, hey, we'll do you a favor. We'll publish this. We'll pay you not a very big advance. The two story collections that I published with Bloomsbury, one of them was initially published by University of Massachusetts Press because it had won the Grace Paley Prize, which was AWP's fiction prize, that they short fiction prize. So they published it in
Oh,
hardcover, but then
cool.
Bloomsbury published it in paperback, and they gave me an advance of $6,000 for that. So compared to an advance for a novel, that's not a lot of money. But if it were a small indie press, $6,000 would be a really good advance.
You know, what you were saying before about titles and how for your short stories and your poetry, you kind of start with a title. It really kind of made me start thinking about how a title, and I have no experience writing either, so I could be completely wrong. But the idea that just entered my mind is that the title must play an equally important role in the shape of the story because it can kind of like create that starting point, whereas for a novel the title does, I mean, obviously a title is very important for a book, but it doesn't necessarily have to inform the entire scope of the work. Like for a short story and a poem, it's so short that every single element of it plays a crucial part to it. Whereas a novel, the title is kind of, I don't know what the word is, but I don't, that's just my master
And the same
shop
way. Yeah.
comment for the night.
No, I think that's really interesting because I feel the same way. Like often successful novels don't, I mean, they don't always have the most interesting titles. Some of them
Mhm.
do, obviously. But some of them are just like, you know, well, this was a pretty successful book and I actually like this title, but it's just a two-word title, The Sellout, which was written by, I think, Paul Beatty. And but then there's some others like the George Saunders novel that won the Booker Prize, Lincoln in the Bardo. That's kind of a mysterious title because people probably don't know what a bardo is unless they know about Tibetan. I think it's like the sort of not purgatory, but it's sort of the anteroom to
Oh, I did
the
not know that.
afterlife. I can't. I mean, it's like this holding cell essentially, and once you die, that you're in this. So it's a kind of like purgatory. But anyway, people, you have to look that up. I had to look it up because I could not remember. I probably had learned it at some point in college or in some, religion or theology class that I had to take. But though, I mean, those titles, they're not going to be the biggest selling point of the book. It's probably the author's name or the press. If it's a really good literary imprint, people will buy that book. Or if it's a romance novel, I mean, Colleen Hoover. What I know, what are some of her titles? Is Verity
Oh
one of them?
Gosh.
Ver
There's one,
Verity was
there's like the
one.
series.
It ends with us. It starts with us. I feel
Yeah.
like
Oh,
I
those are two
feel like we
different
should know
books.
these answers.
People buy her books because of her name now. They're not buying it
Yeah.
because she has a great title. So it's like, for her, she could just call it like bubble wrap and some, I mean, that's actually kind of a good title. I
But
like
that
that
kind of
title.
sounds like an interesting
Yeah.
title.
Yeah.
But I want
Bubble
to
wrap
give
I'd
that
buy.
level.
I want to buy a novel called I want to write that novel.
I want to get to that point where they're just like, oh, she wrote a book called The Telephone Book, but it's a Diana Giovinazzo original, so I'm gonna buy it.
Yes. You're like
I want that.
your titles, Antoinette Sisters and The Woman in Red, they're evocative, they're also gendered. There's a sense of like history, especially to Antoinette's sister. Like people are going to immediately associate that with Marie Antoinette, or a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people will.
They do, and it's funny is that I didn't want Antoinette's sister to be the title of Antoinette's sister. I wanted the Neapolitan Queen. I wanted something
Oh, I love that.
else. Yeah, and the marketing department overruled me on that one. And it was a smart decision, I will say that. But I still like the Neapolitan Queen. But they knew what they were doing when they were saying, okay, we want to make that connection to Marie Antoinette.
Yeah, because she's an immediately recognizable historical figure that, a lot of people would buy it just based on the fact that you wrote about she's
Marie
in,
Antoinette.
her sister obviously is
Yeah.
she's the focal character, correct? Her sister.
Yeah, and I think I got one bad review once. I got like a 2-star review. They're like, oh, I love the book. The book was wonderful. But I didn't like the title because it was about Antoinette's sister and it was not as much about Antoinette.
You're thinking like, I'm not interested in false advertising. That's why it's called that. I love it when you get a review where it's like, this book arrived in terrible shape and 1 star. I'm like, that is not the point of the review. Like, don't review the delivery, review the book. Or I've gone back and forth with, I have a former student who does a lot of book blogging, and she still reviews books if she hasn't finished them.
Mhm.
And I'm like, don't review it. Just do not, like, just don't post a bad review if you haven't even finished it. I know it happens fairly often.
Yeah, and they give so many books to people. Like reviewers often can get inundated with, because I used to do reviews, and I would just get inundated with books for the blog that I had, and there were so many that were there was this push for how much, for the time. And I feel like a lot of reviewers, I think it comes down to that deadline time of being able to get this review out in a timely manner for this book, for this thing. And that's kind of frustrating. So I could kind of see where they come from in that regards.
Yeah. I mean, if you can't read it, this was like on Goodreads, like don't review it, I mean,
yeah,
especially if it's a book with a small press and the authors are not getting that many reviews,
in general, even if it's a bigger press and they're still, pushing for reviews, wait until it's finished. It's okay.
Take your time, enjoy it.
And it's okay if you don't finish a book. DNFs are not something to be ashamed of. And I switched, I'm no longer on Goodreads for my own book reading stuff. I'm over at Storygraph. And what I love about that is that I can keep track of my books on Storygraph, and it allows for me to do a DNF on a book. If I say I did not finish the book, I can mark off, oh, I didn't finish it. I'm not gonna, you can come back to the book. If you don't finish the book, come back to it at a later time. You're like, okay, I'm gonna give this another try. That is perfectly okay. And the DNF just kind of like, it does, and Storygraph, they just say, okay, they don't register it as a book that's been read. And so it just goes over there. And if you want to go pick it up again to go read it, there's no like issue with that on it. And I think that's a wonderful thing that Goodreads doesn't do.
Yeah, I mean, plus if you're getting several books to many books every week or month, there's just no way. I know a good friend of mine who had a novel come out last July. It's called All the Girls in Town. It's written by this writer who used to actually, she was an actor and she was on Days of Our Lives for a long time. Her name's Stacey Creason. She was in a first, I think she was in a debut novelist group this was 2022.
Mm-hmm.
She got a ton of books that she was expected to read and rate, and she actually would read most of them. But I mean, it was basically a full-time job because there's no way you could do that if you're also balancing a bunch of other obligations. But it's a lot of pressure. I am actually reviewing a book for New City Lit, which is a newspaper in Chicago. It's an arts monthly, but they do a lot of online reviews, and I'm not done with the book yet, and I have to write the review in the next few days, and I'm going to read it. I don't want to a publication like that, you want to make sure you're also getting paid. But I'm like, this is hard. Like, if you're going to properly review a book, you really have to read it, and not I find myself like reading it also at the end of the day when I'm done with teaching work, and I'm so tired, so I'm like, I have to if you're going to really review something, it's tough to do it unless you're really engrossed by it. And this is a collection of essays, which are pretty enjoyable, but also they're really densely written. So it's not like reading a newspaper article.
Sorry, it's been ages. Usually there was a moment in time that Chips he made an appearance every week. And it's been a minute since he came and said hello. So I'm actually a little surprised.
He's very pretty. He has nice fur.
He thinks so too. Thank you. He does. He walks like a little mini panther. Like he's smaller than my dog, who is rather small herself, but he walks like he's the size of a lion. But I'm curious to talk about Please Be Advised, which is the anthology that you said you edited. And I don't know if we've ever had a conversation about what goes into that is the weirdest word, editing an anthology, and what the role an editor plays in that collection. Can you kind of talk us through what that experience was like?
Yeah, actually, the anthologies Love and the Time of Time's Up. So,
oh gosh, sorry.
That's all right. They came out 2 weeks apart, and they're also, I mean, they're both fiction, so it's a lot. But I actually had the idea right before the pandemic changed everyone's lives for 2 years or so. It was in January 2020, and I don't know if you guys were aware of the story Cat Person. By Kristen Ropinian. It was published in the New Yorker in December 2017. So it was 2 months after Harvey Weinstein was outed as a serial sexual predator. And the story is about this college-age woman who has an affair, or not an affair, but she has a relationship with a guy who's at least 10 years older than her. And it becomes like this abusive relationship, not physically abusive, but just, sort of dark. And the story is witty, and it's got like the ick factor, and it took off. It went viral. And the New Yorker fiction editor Deborah Treisman said she'd never seen a story take off like that. Well, part of that was probably because a lot of people actually thought it was nonfiction, so they thought it was an essay rather than a short story. And all that aside, I just thought, if people are that taken with a story about sexual predation, I also find stories about sex and desire, and also how it can go off the rails, really interesting. So, and I also had been writing one book after another and not selling them in New York. And I was getting agents that I liked, who were really successful agents who liked my work, but then were hitting a wall because my previous books, the 2 novels and 2 story collections that I'd published with Bloomsbury over a pretty short period of time, it was only 6 years that I published those 4 books within. They just hadn't taken off. And most books, I don't know, I teach a publishing industry class, so I'm thinking about this stuff way too much for it to be healthy. Because like as a writer, I don't really necessarily want to know all this stuff, but most books, even ones with big presses, do not sell more than 1,000 copies. But the ones we hear about are we hear about them in part because they are probably selling more than 1,000 copies. So most books, even at big presses, because if they're publishing way too many books per season, they cannot give those books lower that are farther down on their lists much, publicity or marketing muscle or money. So they just sort of fall away unless the author is really, really committed to getting the word out and trying as hard as possible to market and do events, etc. But I wasn't selling books, and I was really frustrated because I was writing books I really liked. And I thought, well, I'm going to edit an anthology and find, the agent that I was working with seemed to be amenable to going out with it to big presses, because I lined up some writers who were, pretty successful. They were all literary fiction writers, so not like huge bestsellers, but, Lynn Freed, Elizabeth Mackenzie, who had published The Portable Veblen, which was nominated. It was a long listed title for the National Book Award in 2015, I think it was. People who I really respected. And so the anthology, I brought it together. Marcy, my agent, then said, well, the pandemic hit, I'm not going to try to sell it. So she's like, no one's buying books. And I was thinking, someone is buying books. Like, people are actually buying books to read. So I assume agents are still selling books, and then their publishers are still going to publish them. But I think she just figured this is going to be hard to sell, and I don't want to try. So I ended up finding an independent press in Chicago that eventually, it took like a year and a half. And so then we published Tortoise Books. We published that in last October 2022. And I queried the writers who are in it, because they were all people whose work I was familiar with, and I knew them all personally for the most part. There were a couple that I didn't know very well. But they were great about sending me stories. Jerry, the publisher at Tortoise, paid a small advance to everyone, not a lot, but a little bit of money, 2 copies. And so the book was published. People who read it, which was probably not very many, it's still in print, so people can continue to read it. But they're like, these stories are so, even my father, who is not someone prone to giving compliments, he was like, this is actually really good. And so and also, like, I was worried that men would think, I can't read this book, it's just going to be male bashing, but it's actually not black and white like that. There are nuanced situations in many of these stories. So, and Karen Bender, she was also a National Book Award finalist for her book, Refund, which is it's short fiction, and it's a lot about money and people's relationship to money. She has a story in there too. So it's a great collection. I mean, if I can say that. And I think if it had been with a bigger press, it might have gotten, more attention and few more reviews. But it's, as you probably know, talking to authors and being writers or at least readers, there's just a lot of books, and there's not as many places reviewing books, and bookstores are also, thank God. I mean, LA does have a huge number, and Chicago, actually, where I know where you used to live, Michelle, there were so many great independent bookstores there.
So many.
Yeah. And I did a lot of events at a lot of the bookstores there for my other books when I lived there, and it was great fun, and it was nice to see. But I think things have changed, I mean, there's just been a more of a focus on, I think, genre for one, like a lot of fantasy and speculative and a lot of self-help. Those seemed in celebrity books too. I have a friend who's a ghostwriter, but she herself is also a novelist, and she's published a memoir under her own name. Her name's Sarah Tomlinson, but she's written like 22 books as a ghostwriter, some of them for really well-known people. That, I know this is a tangent, but like, I remember the publicist that I worked at Bloomsbury, I asked her once, I'm like, why are there so many books by famous people? She said, well, those famous people are actually being approached by editors who are hoping that a book by a famous person will sell a lot of copies, which can happen, but it's not a given. Like, Billie Eilish has, I don't know how many Instagram followers, but when she published a memoir, several years ago. I think her sales after the first year were like 65,000 copies, and she's got millions and millions of followers. So that, you know, that's 65,000 is a good, you know, sales figure for someone who's not world famous, you know, like she is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. And the number that 1,000, there's so many books only have like, was it 1,000 copies? They don't even sell 1,000 copies.
Yeah.
I'm just like,
I saw your eyebrows go up.
Yes, especially since I just had a conversation with my agent about my sales numbers. That's
better than 1,000. You have quite a few reviews, you know. I mean, you've had a lot of readers, but go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, but it's still, when so many authors are so focused on the sales numbers, and it's so easy for authors to get into that headspace of, I'm a failure because I don't have this major best-selling New York Times best-selling book, or my numbers aren't what I want them to be, or what I think the industry wants them to be. And in reality, knowing that, you know, if you sold more than 1,000 books, you're doing all right. You're doing okay.
Yeah.
That's so good to hear. That's like a positive thing.
Yeah. And actually 500 is a better benchmark. Like, most books don't even sell 500 copies. But, you know, it's crazy. Like, I was looking at Author Central for Direct Sunlight, and it only tallies books that have been scanned in bookstores, not the Kindle version, which for some unknown reason, Northwestern University Press priced at $19. And the paperback is 20. So, I mean, anyway, that's another topic. But I think I'm at like 280 copies have sold. I haven't done a shitload of events. I hope it's okay to.
That's
swear.
okay.
Oh,
I
keep it out. I haven't. So I've not done as many events as I used to do when I was with Bloomsbury, a Big Five press, and you know, and also those 3 books came out really quickly, so I didn't want to keep pestering my friends like, I'm doing another event, you know, come. So yeah, I'm like, this is not a great. I mean, if I were right now trying to go out with a new book to one of the agents that I've worked with over the last 15 years, they would look at that number and be like, we're not going to, I mean, even if you write, like, if you take dictation from God, we're still not going to be able to sell your book because you've sold so few copies. I mean, that's hard to tell. The book has just been out for 3 months and it's with the university press. So that's probably actually not a bad number, all things considered. But, you know, if I know when I went to this agent whose name is Doug Stewart, in 2017, I'd written this sex comedy. It was I wanted it to be my 5th book with a big press. And he took me on and he's like, this book is funny. I love it. Your sales track for your most recent book, which is a story collection called The Virginity of Famous Men, that Bloomsbury published in September 2016. He's like, it is terrible, but I really like this book and I'm going to try to sell it. So he couldn't sell it. He went to 23 big presses, but it was straight up comedy. So comedy is, you know, really subjective. People find the same, like tragedy, we can all agree that like a shipwreck is tragic, but we don't all think people slipping on a banana peel is funny. So, which actually one time one of my college roommates literally did when we were walking, when we were going out one night. So, and I tell that story way too often, but it was so funny. If you ever see someone actually slip on a banana peel, not on purpose, it is really funny. But comedy is so subjective, but it's my favorite thing. Like, I just love goofy stuff, and I like writing it too if I can. So anyway, I'm going on all these tangents, but
we do tangents here all day.
We love
as long as it's like
tangent.
book and writing related. I don't think it actually qualifies as a tangent because we're still on topic.
I think so. Yeah, it's good for us.
But it is interesting, especially, I mean, Diana and I were just having this conversation the other day about how genre plays such a huge, and me, the armchair expert who has never published a book, but
You've read a lot.
but I've read a lot. No, but how genre plays a very large part in someone's ability to get published. And I don't know if that's the current
Yeah.
climate, or if that's just always been the case and it kind of goes through cycles. But there are so many factors outside of a book being good that determine whether or not it's going to get published.
And also, like, my partner often says to me, he's like, well, if the book won this big award, it must be good. I'm like, well, in theory, or if it's sold for a lot of money, it must be good. And I'm like, that is actually not, it is subjective. So we're not all going to agree. Like if we all read Charles Dickens's entire bibliography, we would not think all his novels were equally good or great. He might not be the best example, but someone who's extremely popular like Colleen Hoover, she herself has even said, like, I know I'm not that good of a writer. I haven't read her, so I can't weigh in on her critically, but she's whatever she's doing, like E.L. James with the 50 Shades of Grey novels. Those books, I don't think we're going to win literary prizes, or I doubt they did.
No, they didn't.
I mean, not the big ones anyway. People did not read them because they were well written. They read them for the sex scenes. So, that that's going to sell. Like if you can somehow if you can capture people's attention. That's something I talk about in the publishing industry class, discoverability. Like, how do people's books get discovered? And I remember one of the essay, or it's actually an interview that I assigned my students, is with this university press director named Donna Shear. And she said, like, for example, a small press like a university press should not be publishing fiction because it's so hard to find the readers for fiction. Unless, like genre, if you're writing genre, you can go to sites online where people love sci-fi, or they love westerns, or they love YA romance. But if you're just writing literary fiction, which is usually what university presses publish, good luck finding the target audience. So her take on that was like, they shouldn't publish it. Poetry is a different story. Like you think like, well, poetry is not going to be a bestseller, but they also have very low expectations. They know their biggest client will probably be libraries, or the biggest buyers will be libraries. And then they maybe will sell like a few hundred copies to the poet's friends. And that's it. And they also don't cost that much to print because a poetry collection is usually like 70 pages. So the costs of it it was so interesting when I started researching the materials for this class, because it's all the stuff that I hadn't really thought about before.
And it's fascinating, especially considering that so often I feel like when it comes to publishing, there's been this hush back room kind of mentality when it comes down to it, where, and it's maybe I think in some ways the publishing industry wants to keep it that way, where they have this mysterious, you don't know how the sausage is made, but it just gets made. But at the same time, it's really good to be able to sit down and have this conversation about it for aspiring authors and for authors that are already out there, so that they realize, hey, I am not a failure.
Right.
That sort of.
Right. And it's funny because, like, I don't know if either of you keep a Substack. You're familiar with that? It's
yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of writers on there. I started one in March, and that's kind of been the theme, and I titled it Bookish. And the post I posted a couple of days ago was about the National Book Award nominations and in award seasons in general. It's like, people, if you don't get nominated for a book award, you feel bad. Like if you expected to be nominated, and often you don't, but when you do, or you want to be nominated for a prize, you have to kind of live with the idea like, oh, I must not be very good, or someone has it out for me, all these narratives in our head about like why things haven't worked out the way we hoped. And I remember a while ago, it must have been like 2016, I think it was probably like 4 books ago, for Ann Patchett. She wrote a piece about like how it was the year that there were only like 3 Pulitzer. They
Mhm.
didn't pick a fiction Pulitzer winner. So
Yeah.
she wrote about that. And she's like, well, I had a book that could have been considered for the Pulitzer and I didn't win it. And, it was a longer essay. It wasn't just about that. But it was really interesting because even someone as extremely successful as she's been, I think it's everyone who's a writer
And
and
she was
published.
up for it. She was up for the Pulitzer for the Dutch House.
Oh, she
And
was? Oh, that's
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, she lost out to Colson Whitehead. He won this for a second time that
Oh, for
same
the
year.
Nickel Boys?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and so a lot of people, because that's one of the things with the Pulitzer is that it's so very political. And a lot of these awards, when you sit down and look at them, like you said, that's not about whether or not you're good. Sometimes it's just politics.
Yeah, and in fact, I have a good friend from college who is the National Book Awards director now. And
Hmm.
we'd emailed because I said my press did not submit direct sunlight and I was upset. They decided to nominate some poetry collections, and also I'm not really sure why they didn't submit my book, but by committee, who knows? As you said, things are political, and I'm sure there
Hmm.
was some of that in the calculus. But Ruth, my friend, told me, she's like, there are so many books that the judges wish they could nominate, but they can't because they do have to come to a consensus. She didn't say the consensus part, but that was the subtext. And I've
Hmm.
had friends who've read for some of the Penn Awards, and also judged for that, and also for the LA Times Book Prize, the prizes. And they say it's horse trading. Like, let's face it, like a
Hmm.
lot of it is horse trading. And I think, if you're gonna have a best-selling novel, be happy. Like, and also just publishing a book itself it's an accomplishment. Like, that was sort of my conclusion in the piece about awards. I'm like, it's a good thing, and we all
Hmm.
suffer. Like,
Hmm.
not
Yeah, and
pardon.
yeah. I was just gonna say, like when it comes to Colson Whitehead, he's a wonderful author. I love his work and everything, and it's great on him. And Anne Patchett, she is a wonderful author as well. But there's so many things that happen behind the scenes for authors that we just cannot control. There's
No.
nothing about this business that we can control the moment we hand the book over to the agent for her to go ahead and submit it. That's
I mean
after
that
that,
that
have
can
no control.
that goes back to our conversation about titles. Like that we authors may not even be able to pick the title that they want for their novel. And I mean, various factors go into that, and the marketing people know what they're doing. But
I like to us
that's
to think that, and I think sometimes they do, but not always.
I feel like it's rare. It's a rare thing. I've been told it's a rare thing because The Woman in Red, that title was with it from the time that it was just a draft in my computer. That was the title all the way up through. And I think it was one of the rarities that actually got to stick, where they said, okay, we're going to keep that title. And everything else, everybody else, I think almost out of all the authors that we've talked to, I want to say at least 80% had a different title for their book.
Yeah.
and that's one of my favorite conversations is what was your almost title? Because that's the title that was born with the book or that the author came up with, and there's usually a story behind it. And I always love hearing the almost titles.
It's funny because, like, I think some of it is when you're with a big press, definitely then. Like, for example, your book, Diana, the most recent book, Antoinette's Sister, Neapolitan Queen. Friends of mine too, and I actually once had to change. I have 7 books. I've only had to change a title once, and that was for Paris. He said I originally called it Paris Gare Saint Lazare, which is one of the train stations, one
Mm-hmm.
of the many train stations in Paris, and that was a pivotal setting for an event. And my agent and editor liked it, but then Bloomsbury's marketing was like, well, and they're like, well, who's going to know unless you speak French or you go to Paris that a gare is a train station.
Mm-hmm.
And so we went back and forth. I had like 100 and some titles that Nancy, my editor, and I added back and forth. And it was hard because I still don't really love Paris, he said. It's just not like people are like, and then the thing is the cover is a whole other thing. Like
Yeah.
sometimes you don't like your cover and you get stuck with it. And but I mean, these are again very privileged things. Like people are really eager to have a book and they would love to be in this situation. But the thing is, like, you just get used to certain things when you are a writer and you've published. Like we all adapt to our environment. So, an aspiring writer is going to be at a very different stage. And then sometimes there's also like inflexibility, like they will not give. And as an experienced author or writer, you're like, okay, I cannot win every battle. So I'm going to just give in. And I knew that with Paris, he said, I'm like, you know what? They want to change it. Okay. The book is still the book I wrote. It's just not the title that I gave it.
Yeah, I have that philosophy myself as well. When it comes to working with your editors and the publisher, I pick my battles. I'm very easygoing. It's like, okay, you want to change that? Great. Want to change this? Okay, fine. But if there's something very, very specific in the book that I want, I would be like, no, we're keeping this. And when I do that, I think with that philosophy where it's like, okay, I pick my battles. If it's something that I absolutely want, the other stuff it's not as big, then I usually end up with getting my way 9 times out of 10. I get my way. Like one of the big things I went to battle over was in The Woman in Red, where there was a specific line that did not relate to something that one of the characters said. And one of the characters happened to be a bit on the dementia side of things. And so, of course, and she couldn't hear well. So, of course, she's not going to say something logical when she's responding to the character. And so I basically said that's what reflected in the dialogue. And my copy editor she fought me on it, where she was like, this can't stay. It makes no sense. And I was like, yes, that's the point. It makes no sense, but it makes sense in the scene in and of itself.
Yeah.
And so I was like, if I'm going to die on this hill, this is going to be the hill I die on for this book. Everything else, yeah, sure, I can change all this other stuff, but I'm going to die on this hill of this one throwaway line, this one sentence that's maybe 6 words at most. I will die on that hill for those 6 words. Everything else I'll change.
I totally get it. And also I did have a copy editor for Paris, he said, who had done a great job with the previous book, Little Known Facts, that I'd published with the same press. But then for Paris, he said she made, I don't know how many edits, like 10,000 edits. And she was like italicizing dialogue, which no, like that completely changes everything tonally. So fortunately, my editor, it sounds like your editor had your back too, but it's so stressful.
It is. And copy editors
like obsessed. Like this is not.
Yeah, and copy editors are a necessary evil. And when it comes to italicizing dialogue, that's a very slippery slope. There's a fine line for what you should and shouldn't italicize on things. And if you over italicize a dialogue in a book, that's not a good thing.
Right. In fact, I've even had read from other writers, or I don't remember. I've talked about it in classes too that I've been in and taught. If you can write it without italics, you've chosen the right words. It's very rare that you actually need italics in your dialogue, unless you're just not picking the right words.
Yeah, I think the only time I will choose italics is if it's a foreign word. If it's in Spanish or Italian and it's into an English reader. And then that's the only time that it actually goes into italics, and I don't have a choice on that. That's kind of the pseudo industry norm at the moment. So I'm, begrudgingly go along with it. But outside of it, yeah, italics are, yeah, no, you don't need to. You don't need to use it in your dialogue.
Right. And there are exceptions. Like if you're writing comedy, or you're like, the people sometimes are really anti exclamation point. I'm like, I love exclamation points if they're used well. So, it's the same thing with italics. It could be a great thing, but it's instinctive, I think, a lot of times.
Yeah. I mean, When it comes to exclamation points, we are not all F. Scott Fitzgerald. We are allowed to use exclamation points in our novels, and I think italics. There's a conversation to be had about them. I suppose, kind of like the Oxford comma, whether or not you use them, like in titles, like this podcast, Michelle, or not. There's always that side of the debate.
I like them.
Yeah. Don't know what you're talking about.
It's the comma before the and if you have a series of 3 or more items. And
yeah, Michelle.
Yeah, sometimes there's no comma. If it's like AP, Associated Press style, I don't think they use the
yes. No, we don't use the Oxford comma.
It saves space.
That's what happens when you ask the journalist to make the title.
And she puts the title on everything, and the novelist is like, wait, where's my Oxford comma? I need my Oxford comma. But no, the journalist who had to do all the sign up all the
and
stuff.
It doesn't even occur to me. And I'm sure if I ever get to the point where I send my manuscript to an editor, that editor's mind is just like they're just gonna want to like reach through a Zoom chat or an email or a phone call and just strangle me, because I can almost guarantee you there is not a single Oxford comma anywhere in that manuscript.
Well,
so
you
I'm
talk
just gonna
about
put
behind the scenes, politics that happens in a publisher. What's going to happen is editor is going to be like, okay, so she's got this background in journalism, so we're going to need to give her to a copy editor who understands that she just doesn't use the Oxford comma at all in her novel.
I'm just gonna have to spend a day just going through line by line and throwing in a comma where it's needed.
No, you're not going to do that because you keep putting off this novel enough.
I mean that too, but that's
you don't need another excuse not to read this novel.
No, I have to read it and put in the Oxford commas, you guys. It's not ready yet. But yeah, I'll just apologize now in advance. I'll try to fix it, but no.
I don't mind.
Yeah.
I add them sometimes when I have a student who's not using them, but it's not like I'm not deducting points.
I have put them in like occasionally I've put in that it just feels weird to me. It feels like, oh, it doesn't go there. It doesn't belong.
I'm sorry, Christine, that you accidentally stepped on this hornet's nest, and Michelle and I are just going back and forth about the Oxford comma.
I'm glad. Actually, the fact is, like, considering the complexity of the world and the suffering and everything, like having a spirited conversation about commas is all right by me.
We have had a very fun debate about italics, exclamation marks, commas, and only authors and readers, maybe authors even a little bit more, can really appreciate the passion behind this kind of debate. And that's, when I feel like tonight is a little bit more of like a masterclass. I feel like tonight has been a masterclass on publishing, and I have loved it.
Good. I find it, no surprise, a very thought-provoking topic, and it's just a huge part of an author's life, like it or not.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Yeah, we have definitely kept you for a little longer.
It was fun. Yeah, I know that your episodes range from like 30 some minutes to 50 some. So I'm sorry. I was a little
No, you're fine. I know you said you still had some work to do, so we don't want to keep you all evening. Otherwise, we can continue to have these spirited discussions about grammar and everything.
We'll go into double spacing and
and space and a half.
Yeah. Indentations. There's like so much more to get into. But yeah, that's generally why we say, we went for roughly 30 minutes. That gives us the cushion just in case.
No, it was really good. I really enjoyed it. So
thank you so much for making time for us tonight. We've had so much fun with you.
Likewise. Well, all right. Take good care, and
Please be sure to
I hope
visit
to
our
meet
show
you both
notes
in person
and
at some
purchase
point
your
down the
copy
road.
of
Yes,
Christine's
I'm sure.
Especially
Absolutely.
since we're As practically always, neighbors,
Well,
bookshop.org
yeah,
supports
yeah.
all of the wonderful authors that took the time to visit our
All right.
show,
Well,
our
thank you again, and hope you
podcast,
guys have
and
a
most
good
importantly,
night.
independent Thank you. bookstores.
Absolutely.
Also, if
Thank
you
you.
have already purchased your own copy of Christine's book, please feel free to support this podcast by buying us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi. The link will be in our show notes as well. Thanks and have a great night.